I would say that Senator Duffy has been subjected for the last 2.5, 3 years to more public humiliation than probably any Canadian in history.
Mike Duffy's lawyer, Donald Bain, minutes after the court threw out all 31 charges against him. What to make of that? Andrew is in Toronto. Chantal is in Montreal. Let me read you one of the many scathing quotes in the judge's decision today. Justice Charles Vaillancourt. The political, covert, relentless unfolding of events is mind-boggling and shocking. In the context of a democratic society, the plotting, as revealed in the emails, can only be described as unacceptable. As I said, just one of many scathing comments that were made today. What should we make of this, Andrew?
It's sort of odd. I mean, the question of Mike Duffy's guilt or innocence was always only a very small part of this whole affair. But nevertheless, that's what this trial was there to discover. And for the judge, late in the judgment, to go off on this tirade against the Prime Minister's office, as richly deserved as it was, and I agree with virtually everything he said about, trying to influence a Senate committee and tampering with an audit and covering up the whole affair. Nevertheless, that wasn't what this trial was about, and I'm not sure it was really appropriate for the judge to have weighed in quite so theatrically as he did on that.
Chantal?
But then he spent, 63 days until today going through what comes across when he gives his ruling as scapegoating. So I'm guessing he couldn't help himself. That being said, this is a reminder that the criminal code cannot be the standard of ethics to which we hold public officials. There is a difference between being a criminal and being an unethical person. Not being a criminal does not make you an ethical person. But the people who should be policing ethics are parliamentarians and party leaders. And there was quite an indictment on that score for both the past government and the Senate.
Well, there certainly was. There were many references to it throughout the judgment today. Here's what the justice said about Nigel Wright, who was a key figure, obviously, throughout this. Nigel Wright was ordering senior members of the Senate around as if they were mere pawns on a chessboard. The kind of things that were said about the way he was chief of staff for Stephen Harper in the Prime Minister's office at that time, the kind of things that were said about not only Wright, but others in the PMO and including the Prime Minister, are there consequences for any of this stuff? I mean, it was pretty heavy-duty stuff. Maybe, as Andrew says, it was out of place for today, but there it was.
Well, certainly there were political consequences. First of all, the first several weeks of the election campaign were taken up with the Duffy trial and the Prime Minister either answering or more likely not answering questions. That certainly didn't help his campaign. And in the months and indeed years prior to that, it took a great toll on the government's credibility and the Prime Minister's personal credibility in particular. So there was a political price to be paid. At this point, it doesn't seem like there's going to be any legal price to be paid for this central question of the $90,000 that Nigel Wright paid to Mike Duffy. We had Duffy offering the defense that essentially he was coerced into it, which remains as bizarre a defense now as it was yesterday. Essentially, the only price he would have paid for not taking the money would be not getting the money. And we never did even get a charge on Nigel Wright for it. So nobody, we have a payment under the table to a sitting legislator in return for his silence on a matter of some embarrassment to the government, and nobody's paying any legal price for it. That is odd.
Chantal?
Yes, but all of the main players in this saga lost their reputations in whole or in part, and that will not be repaired by what happened in court today in any way, shape, or form. I also believe that Stephen Harper's majority mandate was poisoned by this affair, not just because it took a toll on the government, but because the sudden departure of a central person such as the Chief of Staff at a moment's notice in those circumstances meant that the PMO literally was running in crisis mode inside, even as it was handling the usual government crisis. I believe it poisoned the well and led to what happened last fall.
That quote about the chessboard, in some ways, governments have acted, the Prime Minister's offices have acted that way for decades, if not more than a century, in terms of the way they manipulated senators around. I guess in some ways that day's over now.
Oh, where do you get that impression?
Well,
it's not just...
Okay,
no.
but does this government have the same kind of control over senators who can't even be called Liberals?
Well, maybe not over senators, but as you know, they haven't been controlling only senators like Pons, but also their own MPs. And until their own MPs stand up to them, this kind of behavior will be repeated. I'm not saying it's being repeated now. You're right about the Senate, and this is Mike Duffy's legacy. He has turned the Senate over this as a result of this affair inside out. We don't really know how the Senate will function moving forward, and that is one of the results of this this story.
Well, let me show you another quote. This one was from the clerk of the law clerk of the Senate. Moments after the ruling today. Under the rules of the Senate, today's acquittal gives rise to the reinstatement of Senator Duffy as a member of the Senate in full standing with full salary and office resources. Basically opening the door and say, come on back, Senator. It's all here for you. What does this whole episode do to the issue of what is going to happen or not happen to the Senate? Andrew.
Well, it certainly doesn't improve the Senate's reputation. Mr. Duffy's defense was not so much that he didn't break any rules as that there weren't any rules to break. Well, if there weren't rules, there certainly should have been. And so it's more of a condemnation of the Senate than it is an exoneration of him. For him to be now welcomed back because he's met the standard of not being a convicted criminal is not particularly encouraging. If he were running for Parliament, he would have to meet the rather more exacting standard, I might say, of the public's decision as to whether his conduct was ethical and above board and the kinds of things that our ethics codes, for example, demand of public office holders. So the kinds of attitudes that give rise to not just Mr. Duffy's expense accounts, but the whole expense account scandal are not trivial. That comes from a culture of not only entitlement, but unaccountable entitlement. We're appointed for life. We don't have to ever actually answer to anybody short of being convicted of a crime. That remains a problem. And of course, the broader problem, I mean, I'm not sure what is worse, whether having a Senate that is under the thumb of the Prime Minister's office or a Senate that feels entitled to defeat legislation passed by the elected House of Commons, which remains the major issue with the Senate.
Appointed till 75, anyway.
To 75,
yeah. Chantal on this?
Well, I share Andrew's concerns over trading a Senate that's accountable to a Prime Minister or a party leader for a Senate where people are so-called independent, but not just because they may or may not defeat the will of the House of Commons, but because Stephen Harper paid a price for what happened in the Senate amongst the ranks of his senators. If something else happens amongst those new independents, where does the buck stop? They are appointed for life. Their parties won't suffer for it. So I'm kind of curious as to our notion that because they're independent, they will from now on all be saints.
Last word. You get it, Andrew. And it's sort of what happens to Mike Duffy now. I mean, look, this guy walked out of that courtroom today. 31 charges were plastered at him. The Crown went at him with everything they had. The Mounties went after him with everything they had. He walked away because he was found not guilty. They couldn't prove any of those charges. What happens now?
Well, we certainly shouldn't make the mistake of convicting somebody just on the general sense that we think he did something wrong. You have to meet a much more exacting standard of court of law, and rightly so, when somebody's liberty is at stake. But we shouldn't make the opposite mistake of thinking, well, because he wasn't convicted of a crime, nothing happened here and nobody did anything wrong. He was able to beat the rap, if you will. There's no reason to think that he, at this point, committed a crime. You have to take the judge's decision as having seen all the evidence. But I don't think we necessarily have to think that he's behaved honorably here, or that he that he behaved in a way that we should expect of public office holders. I remain, and I think a lot of people would say, he did not.
All right, leave it at that for tonight. Andrew here in Toronto, Chantal in Montreal.